Okay, everybody, I hope you're all doing well. And I'm here for next to last lecture for the semester. Um, this one's on Emmanuel Levinas's Ethics of the Other. So again, we're in the alternative approaches section of the course, and we've got another alternative to traditional moral theory here with Levinas. Earlier, we looked at the ethics of care, and the ethics of care emphasized that what's central to care, as the label implies, that care ethics is not primarily about obligations, but primarily about nurturing relationships and developing empathetic and sympathetic attitudes, right, towards others, right? So those are other regarding attitudes or dispositions. They emphasize not primarily self-creation, but comporting ourselves towards others in particular ways, rather than creating my own authentic existence, like we saw mostly in the last chapter. Levinas's ethics of the other bears a resemblance to care ethics then, and then it is primarily about an altruistic attitude, although it does emphasize obligation. And so, although Levinas's approach is different than much, and very different in some respects from anything we've looked at thus far, Levinas's ethics does emphasize obligation again. So it still has that central notion in it, but it's going to try to ground obligation in a very different way. In Kant, we saw that obligation is grounded in what's universally willable, right? The categorical imperative, right? So reason is what's driving universalizability, is what's driving obligation. There is the foundation of obligation. In utilitarianism, obligation is rooted in the consequences of actions and creating certain states of affairs that maximize overall happiness for the most number of people. Levinas's attempt to ground obligation is going to be very different than either of those. He's going to ground obligation in the experience of what he calls the face-to-face experience of the other. So this is a very different approach to ethics insofar as it is a phenomenological approach. Now, Sartre was influenced by phenomenology and did phenomenological work, as did Simone de Beauvoir. In Sartre's work, at least the early work, the early Sartre, the other is hell, right? Because they're objectifying us through the look or the gaze. And so I primarily understand myself as an object for how other people see me there, at least in the early Sartre. In Simone de Beauvoir, woman is defined as other relative to man. Man is defined as human being, and then woman is the other of man, and so subordinated to the man in patriarchal systems. And here we see this notion of the other play a slightly different role. It's going to be what grounds obligation, or what provokes or calls for obligation. So again, Levinas is a phenomenologist, and what we see in what we're covering from him, that phenomenological approach more predominantly than we saw it in Sartre, although he did try to give like a phenomenology of bad faith, right? And Simone de Beauvoir does try to give a phenomenology of woman's experience as other. In Levinas, he's trying to capture what he thinks is the experience of the moral experience. So phenomenology is an approach to philosophy that doesn't really emphasize rational argumentation the way that most of the philosophy we've looked up until this point in the semester does. It attempts to identify and describe the structures of different kinds of experience, the experience of consciousness. Here, it's going to be moral experience is what Levinas is attempting to describe. And the idea here is that if we're rigorously describing experience, we're identifying something essential or necessary about that experience that makes it an experience of that kind. So phenomenology is a school of thought, a philosophical approach that comes from Edmund Husserl, who was a German thinker and was later developed by Heidegger, and then adopted and further developed in existential phenomenology by folks like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Merleau-Ponty is another thinker that's associated with this. And Levinas appropriates this methodology for ethics, right? Although you find some of this that kind of stuff in Husserl as well, with empathy as well. But Levinas is kind of the main guy for this ethics of the other approach. Like care ethics, it's going to be rooted in an encounter of the other. So it's prioritizing the experience of the other rather than the experience of myself, and trying to create an authentic individual existence for myself, like we saw in Sartre, or even in self-mastery in Nietzsche. Here, the experience of the other is what grounds obligation. So we'll take a little bit of look at what he has to say here. I pulled some quotes out of some of his main works, predominantly Totality and Infinity, and then I'll discuss them as we move through them. And so sometimes you might see this, this approach to ethics referred to as the ethics of alterity, or the ethics of transcendence. Transcendence, what goes beyond, right, or rather, as opposed to what's immanent. So those two things are usually contrasted with one another. And again, the ethics of alterity tries to ground obligation, which is a central moral notion that we've looked at much in this semester. So in that regard, he's similar to previous moral theories that we've looked at, but he's not going to try to develop and defend a theory. He's trying to describe moral experience, right? He's going to have a different way of trying to establish obligation than either Kant or somebody like Mill. So here's a picture of Levinas. And again, you see he's operating in the 20th century, writing in the 20th century. So, you know, he was a European thinker around the same time as Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and these other thinkers, some of these other people that we've been looking at. I've pulled quotations primarily from Totality Infinity, which was his earlier main work. And then, of course, these thinkers, they move through their careers, you know, and develop and refine their views, or sometimes radically change their views. And Levinas did a little bit of that, although he doesn't radically change it. And so the two main works that you would look at for Levinas are Totality Infinity, especially the section on the face there, and Otherwise Than Being, in the chapter on substitution in that book, are kind of the central thing. So if you're going to pick one part of those big works to look at, you'd look at the face section on Totality Infinity and the substitution section from Otherwise Than Being. And again, so this notion is that obligation involves a certain kind of experience, right? The experience of obligation. So we've talked about, you know, this earlier in the semester, what ought I do, or how ought I live? Morality is a lot about oughts, right? And about what we're supposed to be doing. Obligation, right? And so keep that notion of an ought in mind as we go through these passages from Levinas. So the key ideas here, phenomenology, again, there's this slogan that goes along with phenomenology called back to the things themselves. So the idea is that things present themselves to us in consciousness, and then we can rigorously describe those experiences, right? And so what we're looking for is the essence of that experience, or the necessary structure of that experience. And then so a question that we might always ask about phenomenology is, so say after someone's done a phenomenological description of something, and say, okay, well, why should we think that that's unnecessary? Why is that a necessary experience of that thing, or those particular features of that experience, or particular structures of that experience? Why should we think that those are necessary? Levinas has this idea of ethics as first philosophy. So if you look at Western philosophy in general, metaphysics and epistemology kind of go hand in hand, and those are considered first philosophy. So René Descartes wrote Meditations on First Philosophy, and it's primarily about how to know stuff, right? Epistemology, and what sorts of things there are, different kinds of substances. But Levinas thinks that the primary task of philosophy is ethical, right? And so he thinks morality is a first philosophy, rather than that it comes before epistemology, figuring out what we can know and how we know it, and metaphysics, what sorts of things exist and don't exist, right? So he thinks ethics comes first. An essay he has on ethics as first philosophy, again, that you might read as an introduction to Levinas's work. And then some other key ideas that are central here are the notion of the same and the other, the notions of totality and infinity. I mentioned his first work is called Totality Infinity, an essay on exteriority. And then main central notion here is this idea of the face and the face-to-face encounter. So we want to know what he's getting at with regard to those phrases. And then again, although he tries to ground obligation in the face-to-face encounter, obligation is a central moral notion that we've looked at throughout the semester, right? And so obligation and responsibility are central notions here. So in that way, it's not such an alternative theory. What's alternative about Levinas is his phenomenological approach and the way in which he tries to ground or establish obligation. So let me mention just at the outset here, there seem to me to be kind of two basic ways scholars have read Levinas's work or interpreted his work. One is, as I have already mentioned, probably tipped my hand a little bit, that what so we might ask, well, what's Levinas really up to? On the one hand, we might say that what Levinas is doing is trying to describe and give a phenomenology of any kind of obligation, right? So that he's describing the structures of obligation or ought, right? The experience of ought. Alternatively, we might also wonder, well, what Levinas really doing is not describing ought, but telling us the attitude that we ought to adopt, right, in terms of the other. So there's kind of those two readings. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but we could have those, different ways of approaching Levinas's work. Might say that he's doing one of those over the other. And so when we just ask, what's this guy really up to? What's this thinker really up to? Those are kind of two options that present themselves. Here's a passage out of Totality and Infinity where Levinas says what he's trying to do is phenomenology. So this will especially be important for the philosophy majors and minors, and especially those that are interested in contemporary European or what's called continental philosophy sometimes, thinkers that originated on the continent of Europe, right? So he says, my method is phenomenological. It consists in restoring that which is given, right? So earlier I talked about what's given to consciousness, back to the things themselves, which bears a name, which is objective, right? To its background of intention, not only that intention which is directed towards an object, right? So there's this another slogan that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Consciousness is directed or intentional. It's about something. It points at something. It picks stuff out. But to everything which calls to its concreteness to the horizon, right? So things are given within a horizon of experience. I've often said that it is research into the staging of that which is the object. The object which is left to itself is clarified as much as it closes off the gaze, as if the giving was like an eyelid which lowers itself as an object appears, and consequently as if the objective is always abstract. Concreteness is an ensemble of what is lived. So he just talked about the structures of experience, but lived experience, right, of intentionality, which is not entirely heuristic, not entirely interpretive. It includes the axiological and the affective, right? So axiological, study of values, and affective, how things affect what dispositions and sentiments we have. Consequently, meaning is given in the concreteness, and there can be surprised here over the general role of thematization. So one of the things that kind of phenomenology is up to is there's this notion of the epoche or bracketing or reduction. And so there's the way in which we ordinarily go about kind of unreflectively dealing with things in the world. And then phenomenology tries to get behind or underneath that to look at the way things are really given to us, right, in consciousness. So there's the critical moment of phenomenology. What is it revealing? It's not just the ordinary ways, the natural attitude, the way things normally unreflectively present themselves to us, but the way in which they give themselves to us upon reflection or in an attempt to rigorously describe that structure that reveals something new about the way the thing is given, something new about structure, the structure of that experience, right? So again, I'm just going to pick out some kind of what I think of as key quotations about from Totality Infinity that help us elucidate the central notion of the face in Levinas's ethics. So he says, to proceed from the experience of totality back to a situation where totality breaks up, a situation that conditions the totality itself, such a situation is the gleam of exteriority or of transcendence in the face of the other. So let me take a drink of water here. Totality and Infinity is the name of this book, right? Um, so the way I usually think of this, and I'm not an expert on Levinas, although I studied philosophy under a Levinasian, totality is kind of what he's getting at is totality, the way things are given to us, but he thinks there's something underneath that, so the ordinary way in which things present themselves to us is as totality, but what he's trying to do is look at how that is totality is structured, and that's the real underlying structure of how things are presented to us. So he says a situation that conditions the totality itself. And that's what he thinks goes beyond, right, our ordinary experience of things. And this is why he's talking about exteriority, outside, right, of transcendence, going beyond, and that's the face of the other, right? So he says Western philosophy has most often been an ontology. So we'll go back to that notion that he's talking about ethics as first philosophy here. Traditionally, metaphysics and epistemology have been thought of as first philosophy in the Western tradition of thought. So Western philosophy has most often been an ontology, a studying of being, a reduction of the other to the same by its interposition of a middle and neutral term that ensures the comprehension of its being. This primacy of the same was Socrates' teaching, to receive nothing of the other but what is in me. So sameness and other, right? So it starts to get a little bit complicated here. But this next comment's kind of for the philosophy majors and minors. If you think of the theory of forms in Plato and Aristotle's critique of the theory of forms with this third man argument that you always need, if you've got two individual objects, but they're the same sort of thing, in order to show how they're the same, you have to refer to a third, right, thing that they are also participating in, right? So that's kind of what Levinas is getting at here. That in order to understand what sorts of things exist, what things are, ontology being, that the reduction of different things, others, right, always involves a reduction of to sameness, right? So they're not really preserving their otherness or their radical difference. What we're doing is reducing difference to sameness, right? And that involves a kind of violence, according to Levinas. So reducing the other to the same, to Socrates' teaching was to receive nothing of the other but what is in me, reduces them to my own ego or to sameness, right? Rather than preserving their radical difference. And what Levinas wants to do is to preserve the experience of the radical difference, right? Alterity, otherness, rather than thinking of the other as just another me that's identical to me, but just in a different location. Right? So moving on here, the way in which the other presents himself, exceeding the idea of the other in me, there's the disruption, right? Preserving the difference. Here we name face. The face of the other at each moment destroys and overflows the plastic image it leaves in me. The idea existing in my own measure, it expresses itself. So the way in which I kind of think of this is that to preserve the notion of genuinely other and radically unique or singular, right? It is not to say, oh, they're just like me in X, Y, and Z way, but to preserve their otherness. In other words, think of a stereotype, right? And think of what bothers you when someone stereotypes you. What's likely to bother you there is that they're not recognizing how you're different, but they are reducing you to a category, right? They're reducing you to being the same as everybody else in this category, and that therefore not seeing you as a true individual that has your own unique talents, needs, and specialties, and own unique experience, but you get treated like everything else in that category. You get almost treated like a thing again, right? So the face of the other, that which is genuinely different than myself. So I've tried to be consistent about this and use capital other, capital O other for the other that is genuinely different, rather than others that are understood and reduced to the same, little o, right? Lowercase o there. So the face of the other, that which is genuinely alter than myself, or definitely transcends myself, at each moment destroys the overflow of the plastic image. the stereotype, right? So we've all done this, right? View others in terms of a stereotype, right? And kind of done a kind of ethical violence to them in doing so. And you probably had that experience of having that done to yourself as well, right? So the idea of the plastic image, it's the fake image, right? That's the stereotype. And when you genuinely recognize the difference, right, the transcendence of something that's radically different than you, that's what destroys that stereotype that you had of them, that you were using to measure them. So go back to Sartre here. The other in Sartre is always an other that's reducing you to an object, right? But in Levinas, the other, preserving the radical difference of the other, that's what destroys that stereotype, that objectification of you. So he says, the face is a living presence. It is expression. The life of the expression consists in undoing the form in which the existent, exposed as a theme, is thereby dissimulated. The face speaks. The manifestation of the face is already discourse. He who manifests himself comes, according to Plato's expression, to his own assistance. He at each instant undoes the form that he presents. So something that is radically different and is preserving its otherness, right? And being allowed to preserve its otherness, undoes those stereotypes. It undoes that plastic image at every turn. So notice here that the face is a living presence. Sometimes what I have students do when I'm teaching Levinas and trying to introduce Levinas is, before I ever start talking about Levinas, is I have them turn to face a classmate and then to describe all the aspects of the face, of that other individual's face, right? Their physical face. And what I try to elucidate from that exercise, which is kind of a beginning phenomenology, right, of the face, is to ask them, after they do that, to try to make a list of all the characteristics that that face has, and then ask them, well, look, if you were to list off all of those physical characteristics, would it exhaust, or would it completely describe and thus capture their lived presence, right? So the face for Levinas doesn't really seem to be just the sum total of all of our physical characteristics. It seems to be something more than that, a living presence, right? And the living presence part doesn't seem to be captured by just what is material ourselves. So we need to worry about, what is Levinas saying here when he's really talking about the living face? Does a corpse, a dead body, have a face? The answer to that seems no, because he says that the face is a living presence. It's expression, the living expression, right? So the life of expression consists in undoing the form of the existent. So the face speaks, in other words. So then drop down to this next quotation. The other faces me and puts me in question and obliges me. Here we get the face-to-face encounter. So another thing sometimes that I do with students when we're talking about Levinas is that I ask them, like, have you ever walked into a classroom and there was nobody else there? And of course, that's probably happened to most people, right? And then they've also had the experience of walking into the classroom where there was one other person already in the room. And, almost without thinking or unreflectively, we kind of comport ourselves a little bit differently when we notice that there is another living being in the room. That's more what it seems to me Levinas is getting at with the face, this idea that the presence of another lived being structures our experience and our comportment in the world in a particular way. It obliges us, right? It calls for a response, right? And so here's the beginnings of Levinas's idea, is that the face, when we encounter something that's radically different than ourselves, it puts me in question and it obliges me. It calls for a response. So responsibility is responding to, right? So think of this here. I have a picture here it's a little bit of a distorted image here, but it's of a starving child eating what look like breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs off the ground. Right? So Levinas says here, the being that expresses itself imposes itself. but does so precisely by appealing to me with its destitution and nudity, its hunger, without my being able to be deaf to that appeal. So the face is vulnerability or nudity, right? So there's another characteristic that's radically different than me, but it's also what is vulnerable, right? In some way or another. Thus, in the expression, the being that imposes itself does not limit, but promotes my freedom. It arouses my goodness. I have an opportunity to respond, right, to the destitution of others. The face opens the primordial discourse, whose first word is obligation, which no interiority, my own inner subjective thoughts and ego, permits avoiding. The will is free to assume this responsibility in whatever sense it likes. It is not free to refuse this responsibility itself. It is not free to ignore the meaningful world into which the face of the other has introduced it. So what Levinas seems to be getting at, what he is getting at is a structure of subjectivity, right? So our own interiority, us being a subject, right, as opposed to just an object, a thing, but a subject with that experiences the world, right, and experiences the world from different vantage points. What Levinas is up to is normally when we think of ourselves as subject, we think of ourselves as egos, or like Descartes' cogito, I think, right, where there's an I that's thought to be unified and clear and distinct using Descartes' language. And that is a rational subject, the thinking I, that reflects, that's the level of subjectivity where like Kantian morality operates. That's the reflective I, and on the basis of that level of subjectivity that I can will the categorical imperative and use the universalizability test. Well, what Levinas is up to is trying to, and here's kind of the reduction, right, of Levinas, what his phenomenology is, what he's claiming his phenomenology is revealing to us, is that my own individual ego, that is the normal me when I'm a thinking thing in the world that I take for granted, is really structured by an experience of that which is not me. So that's what phenomenology is supposed to be revealing here, is that the structure of my own ego is really conditioned by and made the condition of the possibility, I want to say, for my own ego is really that there are others in the world. And so this underlying layer of subjectivity is ethical, right? So my own ego, my own I, Chris, what that Chris Blakely picks out, what that name is picking out, is really only, I am only what I am as an individual in virtue of the fact that there are others. So subjectivity is really not just about an ego, a rational ego, or even just a desiring ego in Levinas. So they really kind of look like there are different layers of subjectivity according to Levinas, of being a subject, again, as opposed to an object. There's the rational I think, right? There's the level of enjoyment. Levinas talks a lot about enjoyment and needs and trying to enjoy others, right? And what I can take from the world and the environment for enjoyment. And then lower than that, even more fundamental than that, is this ethical subjectivity that is really structured by the encounter with others. So the most fundamental aspect of being a subject in Levinas's view is that that totality is conditioned by others, right? And then here we get a little bit more out of Levinas. He says, and here's a little bit also a way of introducing what a worry might be in Levinas, because it doesn't look like he gives us, whereas Kant tries to give us a test for figuring out what our obligations are, at least. Perfect versus imperfect duties, duties to help, duties to not do certain stuff to ourselves. Levinas here says, the will is free to assume this responsibility in whatever sense it likes. It is not free to refuse this responsibility itself. And so subjectivity is a responding to others. Right? So that responsibility for Levinas is not so much a matter of accountability for this, that, or the other, but it is the structure of having to respond to. Responsibility is responsiveness to the face of the other. So he says, the other, whose exceptional presence is inscribed in the ethical impossibility of killing him, in which I stand, marks the end of powers, what I can do to it. If I can no longer have power over him, it is because he overflows absolutely the idea, the stereotype I can have of him. Right? So think of negative othering is discussed in the textbook by Falzone. That's a way of construing the other as foreign, as threatening, and trying to get rid of it to the point of exterminating the other, or objectifying the other to the point of exterminating it. Right? Levinas here is saying that the other is what marks the limit of what I can do. Right? So to be I, an ego, and not only an incarnation of a reason, is precisely to be capable of seeing the offense of the offended or the face. So again, we get this notion that the face is about vulnerability. The deepening of my responsibility and the judgment that is borne upon me is not in the order of universalization, Emmanuel Kant, Kantian ethics, beyond the justice of universal laws. In the third formula of the categorical imperative, I am supposed to legislate as if I am a member of a kingdom of ends, right? The I enters into the judgment of the fact of being good. Goodness consists, he's talking about moral goodness here. Goodness consists in taking up a position in being such that the other counts more than myself. Right? So here the idea is that the other, in Levinas, here you see the kind of radical, what I think of as radical altruism of Levinas's ethics, is that others always count more than myself. So this is not a project of creating and mastering myself like we saw in Nietzsche and like we will see similarly in Foucault in the next lecture. Here, the idea is that to be good, morally good, is to always put others first. So it's altruism, right? So goodness consists in taking up a position in being such that the other counts more than myself, that the vulnerable count more than me, that others are more important, ethically speaking, than me. So being good is about responding to the needs of others, similar to care ethics in that regard, right? So there's this other contemporary European philosopher named Jacques Derrida who calls Levinas's ethics an ethics of welcoming the other, welcoming the vulnerable, the needy. We have a quotation to that end from Levinas. In welcoming the other, I welcome the on high to which my freedom is subordinated. So I mentioned earlier the physical characteristics of a face, the material construction of the face. Does it capture the lived presence of it? Well, what Levinas is saying is that, we try to describe totally, in totality, the physical appearance of the self, but the lived presence seems to escape that. There's this other essay Levinas has, or portion of a book, where it's called the infinite, right? The face gives the infinite, right? So the lived presence of another is not really capturable in just the physical description of all the characteristics that individual has. That seems to leave out that which escapes, or that which is the lived presence, which is the infinite of the other. On high. In many respects, in the way I was taught Levinas was against the backdrop of Martin Buber. So you had the I and the thou. So there's the ego, and the thou is God, which is infinite, right? Levinas is working in that same kind of tradition, or out of that same tradition. So here we have Levinas a little bit more this is from Ethics and Infinity, right, which is a book of interviews, which is really probably more accessible than some of Levinas's major works. So you might check that out if you're really interested in Levinas, to look at that set of interviews. He says, access to the face is straightaway ethical. There is first the very uprightness of the face, the upright exposure without the defense. The skin of the face is that which stays most naked. Again, we have vulnerability there. Most destitute in need, right? It is the most impoverished, right? It is the most naked, though with a decent nudity. Something about sexual nudity, right? It is the most destitute also. There is an essential poverty in the face. The proof is that it is the one that tries to mask the poverty by putting on poses and by taking in countenance. We try to mask ourselves, right, by putting on postures. Right? The face exposed, menaced as if inviting us to an act of violence. At the same time, the face is what forbids us to kill. The question I always have about Levinas, and I'll come back to this at the end, which is part of the criticism, one of the criticisms that can be raised against Levinas, I think, is that, well, earlier we saw that reducing the other to the same is what does violence in Levinas to the other, ethical violence at least to the other by objectifying it, because it doesn't preserve its difference, right? Its alterity, its otherness, reduces it to my own ego. Why is it why shouldn't I kill the other? Right? So in Levinas's Totality Infinity, his examples of the other are the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, right? All these people in needs, and those three things should sound familiar to anybody that's read the Bible, right? What about when the other that's radically different than me is a threat, right, to me? Am I supposed to welcome that? What am I to do with that? So why is it that the face, if it's radically different than myself, why is it that it forbids me to kill, right? As Levinas is thinking here. Why is it that, and that's obviously an extreme example, why is it the face of the other resists objectification, in other words? Right? So why isn't, if it's radically different than me, doesn't that make it easier to, in the language of your textbook, negatively other that rather than welcome it? Then a little quotation here out of Substitution. So, or excuse me, otherwise than being, in the chapter on substitution. So in substitution, my being that belongs to me and not to another is undone. And it is through the substitution that I am not another, but me. Again, radical difference. I'm not just you, but in a different spot. I'm radically different. All right, so there's, again, Levinas's notion of the other. Again, what he's up to is trying to give a description of moral experience. So the ought of morality, that I am obligated and to respond to the other, is grounded in this confrontation of that, or the encounter with that which is not me. So your book does some interesting little commentary here with the movie Aliens, because there are certainly others, and they are threatening others in the movie Aliens. Right? So be sure and read that section of the textbook. It's pretty good. So let's, just to recap then, so Levinas's ethics of the other is grounded in obligation. But one of the things I kind of left out here is that I have an infinite obligation, right? My obligations never end. To calculate and say where my ethics, my ethical obligations, like in a Kantian sense, to, I don't have that contributing to the happiness of others in Kant is only an imperfect duty. I have to do it sometimes, but it's wrong to always refuse charity to others, right? Because sometimes I might be in need. So if everyone always refused charity to others, then whenever I was in a time of need, I wouldn't get any charity from others, right? So that's trying to draw the boundaries of our obligations there. Well, for Levinas, there are no boundaries. There are no boundaries to our responsibilities. We are infinitely obligated and infinitely responsible for the other. So there's a fairly radical aspect of Levinas's ethics. All right, so let's take a look then at a couple of pieces of commentary on Levinas's ethics, and then kind of raise a couple of possible problems with Levinas's ethics. So Alfonso Lingus was an interpreter of Levinas's books into English, and also counts himself as a kind of sympathetic ear to this approach to ethics. And he wrote an essay called Bare Humanity, in which he kind of provides a commentary and also raises a possible problem with Levinas's ethics. So let's take a look at that real quick. First quotation here helps give us a little bit of, helps illuminate and gives us some more information about Levinas's ethics. He says, "The one who says that in turning him away, I do not recognize ordinary humanity, is saying that humanity is imperative, makes claim on me." So remember, Levinas earlier said, I had that quotation where experience of the other puts a demand on us, it obliges us, it obligates us. "But I do not make a social contract with humanity. It is my membership in humanity, anything else other than the succession of my responses to individuals who face me, put demands on me. It is not then that recognizing ordinary humanity is acknowledging that anyone who knocks on my door and faces me puts a demand on me. Infinite obligation. Anyone who needs me puts a demand on me." So our obligations are not simply formulated in terms of like our rational ego and social contract theory, right? Such that we only agree to certain obligations and therefore have limits to our obligations. It's infinitely obligated to others. I am always to put the other before myself. So he continues, Lingus continues, being faced is encountering someone who is not simply similar to me in another place, right? So there's the reduction of the other to the same. That's not what we're up to here. That's not what Levinas is up to. Occupying a different point of view, acting in a different practical field in which the time marked by his oncoming death encloses him. It is encountering someone who appeals to me and puts demands on me which bind me. In his appeal, his demand, he stands apart, other, preserves the difference, right? So other with a capital O, the other that is radically different than me, rather than just another version of me or like me, just in a different spot, different vantage point. Little o, other. He is other with the otherness of an imperative. An imperative is a force that binds me that does not have its own source in my initiative, right? So that's a very different way of construing obligation than in Kant, where it's me, especially in the first formula, the categorical imperative, where I'm left to myself as a monological reasoner to derive my obligations. And then if everybody performs the test right, we end up with the same obligations, right? So this is an obligation that is not rooted in the rational self. It's rooted in a more fundamental aspect of subjectivity, that ethical subjectivity. Ethics is first philosophy, right? That really conditions and is the possibility of my own ego in the first place. So that's what Levinas's phenomenology again is revealing, is that my own subjectivity is really only what it is in virtue of encountering others. So beneath subjectivity is really intersubjectivity. Right? So he continues on here, a little more commentary from Lingus. For Levinas, someone who faces me shows me that I have to say, shows me what I have to say and do. Because to face me is to appeal to me, to expose wants, needs, and expose the spasms, wrinkles, scars, wounds of his or her own skin. Lingus has this book called The Imperative that's filled with his photography. And it's, I'm not an art critic, but it's pretty cool looking photography. And it's these faces of others, right? That seem to call forth for a response, right? So when I turn to someone who faces me, I'm immediately afflicted by these wounds, these wants, this suffering. For Levinas, the fundamental imperative, the sole imperative, is to respond to the needs and wants of the suffering of someone of my species with all the resources of my environment. So again, the fundamental morality, ethics, in Levinas's view is fundamentally about obligations to those in need. And to give them what they need without regard really for my own self and what I want. That's already to start off on the wrong foot for Levinas. So notice here we haven't really got an argument. Like in Mill, he gives us what's the proof of the principle of utility, and kind of runs through this argument. And Kant, does a similar thing with the categorical imperative because of our rational natures, right? For Levinas, that's already starting off on the wrong foot. So Levinas's ethics is not grounded in reason like most philosophers would want. It's rooted in an experience of the radically other. In other words, I don't want to call it an irrationalist approach to ethics, but it is a non-rational approach to ethics. Ethics is grounded in a non-rational experience as opposed to the reasoning I that is a part of that rational subjectivity. It's more fundamental than all of that. So some potential problems then for Levinas. So that's one of the ways in which some philosophers read Levinas and they're like, oh, that's not philosophy, he's not presenting any arguments, right? Because to present an argument for what your obligations are is to already miss the point of ethics. It's about an affective relationship to the world and comportment to the world. So again, go back to that issue, is what Levinas is doing, giving us the, describing the structures of an ought, of obligation, right? And the experience of that that's supposed to be universal across whatever kind of ought you experience, that's the experience of the other is what is essential about that? Or is he telling us what we need to do in order to live ethical lives is to comport ourselves towards the other such that they are always counting more than myself? So again, kind of two possible readings of Levinas there. You can read this book called Reading Levinas with a bunch of essays in it, including Lingus's Bare Humanity, to get into that issue. If you're a philosophy major and minor and interested in continental or European philosophy, I encourage you to do that. So with that in mind, let's turn to some possible criticisms of Levinas here. Some potential problems for the ethics of the other. The first one, and this is one that's mentioned in your textbook, and which there's a good bit of literature on, scholarly literature on, is whether the face is limited to humanity. We just saw Lingus indicate that that's the way he's reading Levinas, that it is limited to humanity. So if that's the case, do animals not have a face, and am I not, do I not have any obligations to animals? So if not, then that approach seems to exclude responsibility to non-human animals, or to limit morality to just interpersonal relationships among a particular species. Right? What if aliens really do come down? Am I gonna, that looks like radically other to me. Do I not have obligations to them in Levinas' sense then, if it's restricted to the face of humanity? Another potential issue, does the ethics of alterity, or the ethics of the other, emphasize the other to the point that any concern for my own well-being is therefore counted as immoral or wrong, right? So in Kant, we saw that we had duties to ourselves as well as duties to others, right? There, it was others as rational, other rational agents, right? But in Levinas, we're not, our imperative, the obligation and responsibility does not seem to be either, there's no end to it. It's an infinite obligation to the other, which is always to count more than myself. So does that mean what I really need to do is to give up all of my money until I am poor and destitute, so that others count more than myself? So does that, in Levinas's view, is any kind of concern for my own well-being an immoral thing? That looks kind of counterintuitive, right? So if I'm infinitely obligated to the other, does that mean that any self-regarding concern is immoral or morally questionable in Levinas's view? And then, we have this demanding this problem here. Is it really possible, practically speaking, to live up to an infinite obligation to others? If Levinas's ethics sets up a goal that is impossible to meet, doesn't that mean that it is an inadequate or unacceptable form of moral philosophy or philosophical ethics? We've encountered that problem with other theories as well. But Levinas here embraces that, I think. I think he's got a response to that one. I think there's some Levinasian responses to these other things as well. Just not going that far into the issues, is since we're in just an introductory class, but certainly lots to explore here. So Levinas talks about justice in a way that justice is always to be done. It's always in the future. So again, there are never, you always need to be better in Levinas's view. You should never say, well, justice achieved. We don't have to worry about that justice thing anymore. We don't have to worry about that obligation thing anymore. It's always ongoing. And then lastly here, is the self, the ethical self in Levinas's view, simply just a passive being? This is another one from another criticism from the textbook. So it looks like to be transformed ethically that I have to wait around for an experience of the other. So does that mean that the self is just a passive thing, that without others we're non-moral or immoral? Shouldn't Levinas have a view of the self as more of an agent, creating and transforming themselves, rather than passively waiting for an encounter with that which is radically other to themselves? So back a little bit to Lingus here, Alfonso Lingus's essay. The end of that essay raises a kind of problem for Levinas's ethics. To me, this is kind of one of the more serious objections to worry about with regard to Levinas. And I kind of intimated it or gestured towards it a little bit earlier. So this essay, Bare Humanity, Lingus's essay, it ends with a short account of a poor Brazilian prostitute. And so then I asked this question, drawing out of that essay. Does the phenomenology of the face indicate whether we should protest sex tourism on behalf of the prostitute, that I should feed the prostitute, etc., or, and here's the worry, or solicit the prostitute's services? So we got a worry here. on the one hand, it looks like preserving the otherness of that prostitute is precisely what enables me to procure her services, solicit her services, and seemingly do violence to them, right? Because they're radically not me. So does Levinas's ethics here, does it really do very much a good job in telling us what kinds of obligations does it really help answer the question, what ought I do, beyond count the other more than yourself? Well, but that doesn't give me much guidance, right? It doesn't tell me, again, whether I should protest sex tourism, which is a big thing in some countries, right? Like in the Philippines or in Brazil, where I have a picture of that here to go along with the essay, right? Isn't it what enables that man to treat those human beings as a commodity, the fact that he recognizes them as other than himself, right? Not the same as himself. That seems to preserve their difference, right? Their radical alterity, but it's precisely that radical alterity that enables him to objectify them, right? Well, look, that looks like a problem for Levinas's ethics. Lingus here is pointing out that it is precisely and recognize the vulnerability of the prostitute that enables one to consider objectifying them, that negative othering in the first place. So every once in a while you see like the Octomom or something like this, who it is well known in popular culture, but clearly in need of help in some way. They have all these children, and then, you know, someone offers them, like some pornographer offers them a job to shoot a film. Well, isn't that offer, right, playing off of their vulnerability, right, and the fact that they're radically other than them? So this seems to be a problem here. In short, it looks like a phenomenology of the other can just as easily be employed to promote the very kind of objectification of the other that Levinas's ethics is supposed to work against. And so if that's the case, that looks very problematic. Your phenomenology of the other isn't really promoting aiding others, right, as you kind of set out to do. It's aiding in it's being employed in the service of objectification, the exact opposite of what this experience of the other is supposed to do for us, ethically speaking. So there's a bit of, looks like a big worry there for Levinas. Then on that same point, consider the following. I've been thinking about this a little bit, so I don't want to hang my hat on it, but here we have a picture of my one of my Zoom classes this semester as we've been doing things radically differently. The experience of lecturing to a machine, a computer screen, is very bizarre. I don't have an encounter with the other here. At most, I have an encounter with this little box up here that is just a video feed of me, right? And then this screen of PowerPoints. It's a bizarre experience. It's not really what I signed up for in terms of teaching. And I knew that I was going to be talking about Levinas, of course, this semester, and then I started to worry about the other and what does and doesn't have a face in the Levinasian sense when I started doing some Zoom classes, some live Zoom classes, where my experience was of it's not clear to me that there was a face here. In these interpersonal relationships, I had a Zoom set up, but I wasn't getting a live video feed of most of my students. In fact, in this instance of the picture here, I was not getting a live video feed of any of my students. I wasn't even getting a voice. All the people in that Zoom meeting had muted themselves, and of course there are some reasons, some practical reasons why people might want to mute themselves, stuff going on in the background of their houses and stuff like that, right? So it's, again, I don't want to hang my hat on this or be too hard on it, but it does raise a issue, I think. So they all muted themselves, and they also most of them didn't put a picture of themselves up, even a still picture. So there was no video feed. There was just a name there. In some cases, there were still pictures. Since in some cases, in one case, a still picture of the student, right, with her dad, and in another case, it was like another picture with a little, like a kind of almost like a little meme thing that had been put up there. So how is it that we present ourselves to others in these sorts of online communications in class? That's a very different class experience than I'm used to. Usually I can at least see some faces and whether they're bored, confused, or pissed off, right? But in a Zoom class, in this scenario, I didn't even have that to go off of. So my question here is, if we're doing this sort of thing, are we defacing ourselves in the Levinasian sense? Do I still have obligations here? Or so what are they? So is that a limitation of Levinas's ethics? On the one hand, I want to say, well, there are still people on the other end of those computers, but you know what? I'm not so certain about that. In some cases, I would refer to a student by their name and got nothing in response to them. I had no interaction, no intersubjectivity there. So what am I to make of that? Was there really a person on the other end of that, or did they just turn it on and leave? So there's this question: how is it that Levinas earlier in one of the quotations talked about how we perform certain roles? Well, can some of those roles and the way we present ourselves, can we deface ourselves in some way, such that we are objectifying ourselves in some way and doing ethical violence to ourselves in some way? So again, just another kind of thing that got me thinking about our recent situation here in terms of trying to continue education online in ways that are very different than what we signed up for, either y'all or me. So again, I don't want to harp on students that did this too much. You know, there might be very good reasons for not wanting a video feed of your home out, right? People walking around behind you or something like that. But it did make me wonder about, you know, the limits of the face and the limits of Levinas's ethics. If there is no face there, there are no obligations there, right? So again, trying to kind of tease out a potential problem or limitation of Levinas's ethics. All right, so that's the end of this lecture on Levinas and the other. Next time we move to Foucault, who is kind of very different than Levinas in a lot of ways, but as we'll see, very, very relevant to our current situation in some interesting ways as well. So again, if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email, post in the discussion forums. I've only this whole time I've only really gotten 4 philosophical questions about the material. So I'm curious to know how well people are really making it through the material or not. The quiz grades have been okay in my ethics classes, so I'm not too worried about that. But I'm still kind of worried about how well people are mastering the material, because I've been on my own, not having much interaction, no real encounter with the other here at all. So shoot me an email if you have questions, get in contact with me. I'm available during office hours, of course. And otherwise, I hope y'all are all doing well and taking care of yourselves and your friends and family. And we'll wrap up the semester here pretty quickly. Y'all take care.